think this story about the in between the universal economy, might say, and the universal cosmopolitan values we share, or we may not articulate them universally, but you know, that trust me, I'm my own God, and you know, you don't have to have my God, but you can trust that I have my own God just as you do, and respecting all this and so on. But I think this kind of area in between, which is not my spiritual existence or my economic existence, is a kind of unnameable area, best left unnamed, but respected. Meaning, because it's best left unnamed, it's best not spend too much time talking about it. Because I don't know that I don't know, I always feel that if you can just focus on the economic life and challenging the way we understand it, giving it context, giving it a plot that has validity, then quietly this question that you're asking gets an answer, but not from anything I'm going to say. It's sort of somehow, it's a stupid thing. It's somehow in our DNA to know the answer to this question. But the way we understand economics, because the nation state has caught itself on the economic life, we never get to that question. And so we're in a mess of different nations trying to be the economy, trying to put their stamp on the entire economy. This is an unspoken fact. And the primary nation that's doing this is the Anglo-Saxons, of course. We can come back to that, but that's the story. So we don't have a one world economy, because the English are too busy. It's what I call the last imperialism. But I kind of stayed away from that because I rely on, I'm speaking all the time to people's cosmopolitan sense. And then I focus on the details of economic life. But I know it's going to bring them into this space, which I'm not going to intervene in, you know. Even the language, I use English because I have to. But you know, strictly speaking, eventually the language of a world economy is simply bookkeeping. So there's no language needed for it. There's not a lot of numbers, and you need to know how they work. But ultimately, you don't need your language to understand bookkeeping. And so that's not a small point I'm making. The real world language, as far as economic life is concerned, is we all do double entry bookkeeping, and that's it. We may have problems I don't know if we do. I've never been to China, so I don't know what the abacus does, right? But we can get into that later, maybe. But the future of language of economic life is not English. It's just accounting. So even there, the English have a problem on their hands. But for the main, we use English for a lot of reasons one could say, and they're not all malign or, you know. I was in Holland last week, and I kept saying, "Why do you always speak English, you guys?" You know, I went to a conference there were 300 people in this conference. I was one of maybe 20 who were English. The whole conference was conducted in English, the entire conference, because they said that's how we like to do it. You know, we're much happier when it comes to international affairs or whatever. We don't use our own language, so we don't. So it's not because we've put that on the Dutch, but no way, if you know our history. It's something they've elected to do. So there's something about the English language, you're using it. Which has this, it belongs to everybody, you might say, but then if it's your language, you have to be careful not to be proprietorial about it. This is a very challenge for the English, and all that will be hidden. Any critique of economics or economic history will be a critique of the use of the English language. Actually, I've already said we don't do zero inflation, sunny climes. You know, so in all these things, as far as the English language is concerned, I'm quite challenging. I'm challenging for my translators because I use language they don't quite get. If they know their English, they don't get the way I'm playing with English half the time. And it's tricky in central banks and places because I play with the language there. And I wouldn't get in if I just spoke my own language. So I'm always using their language, but not quite. And this is quite well sensed and respected. What did you just say? And I didn't say anything, but what they're picking up on is I use this word with that word, and normally they're never put in the same sentence. This I know, but I haven't actually said anything. And so a lot of this that I'm talking about now, even on this podcast, is pushing the limits of the English language, and particularly how that is used to explain economic life. And I want to come on to that now in a very particular way, because if we can identify there's this problem of the grey time, and we have to, one of the things we need to do is go back to the 16th century and at least imagine that the life of the nation, of the state, had started to run parallel, you might say, with the economic life. I'm trying to work with my drawing so that while the economic life goes its way, the national life goes its way also, but they're not glued together. They respect one another. This would unpack a whole lot of problems that we have. I won't list them now, but it just would. And so you can do that as a what if exercise. You don't even have to say it is like that. You can just make a hypothesis like I'm doing. There was a grey time, and we can clarify what that might mean. And even now I'm looking at the Bank of England very deliberately. In the basement of the archive of the Bank of England, it's such good fun to start exploring the original documents to see whether they support the thesis that all King William wanted to do was recognize that other people run the economy, not the state. And if that was the case of the Bank of England, since it's the mother of all central banks, it will be the case for all central banks of which it was the mother. Mm-hmm. So it's actually a huge topic. And if it's true, you can kind of step on that truth and get away from the half-baked truth when you muddle these two things up. And that will come down quite technically. And Steiner is always mindful of this. You will never find Steiner doesn't have a lot of time for banks or central banks. In fact, in his image of the world economy, in my understanding, there are certainly no central banks in it, probably no banks. There's a lot of financial literacy on the part of everybody. And there's a lot of kind of co-working between, I don't know, companies and customers, I don't know what. But the intermediary of the banks is pretty absent in Steiner's mind, as I think it is technically today. It's there by tradition, there by I don't know what. But banks are scared stiff that they are yesterday's story. Mm-hmm. Even there, though, I can go up my high street, and since COVID, every single bank is closed. I've been in meetings with banks saying we daren't shut the branches on every corner. They cost us a fortune to have them, right? But the psychology of the nation depends on there being a bank on every corner, so they would not close them. But in COVID, they've all gone. So there's a lot actually happening, and the banks are still functioning, right? And people don't need a bank on every corner to be whatever. So there's a lot actually out there if you look at the phenomenon more carefully and maybe with these guiding thoughts. You just find the landscape we're in is not the one which is so doom-laden, because that landscape is created by thoughts other than the ones I'm sharing. So if we come into a particular thing, what I wanted to take as my main theme in this session was something which is crucial for Steiner, and we're only going to get to touch on in this session, which is not to think of the economy as a machine that you kickstart, but as some kind of living thing, or at least as a process, as something that's taking place, and it's got many things going on. But what it is not a machine. So you can't go out and start it. Like, a machine by definition, you start it and you stop it. There's no way you can start and stop economic life. It's a ridiculous analogy, and it's best dropped. But if you drop it, if you systematically deny yourself this kind of language, I'm going to kickstart my business, you lose all these mechanical analogies, you have a huge problem on your hands. What words are you going to use? And this is not just, it's not just a question of Steiner saying that economic life is about processes and it's not a machine. It has to do with the fact that since the first Renaissance, we've built our understanding on a world of physics and mechanics. And so one of the most important things to understand Steiner before you even get anywhere near him is to know about what I call the Marshallian, it's a Marshallian detour. I have another name for it. But with Marshall, Alfred Marshall, this is a very important piece of history. He is an English economist. He was concerned about two things. First of all, economics needed to become scientific, meaning it had to distance itself from political economy. So he came up with the word economics. And economics in English is a brilliant word because it just links you to physics, mechanics. It just links you linguistically to something which it actually has nothing to do with. But it makes it feel like, oh, it's like real science, hard science. It's like mechanics. This is a big problem because it isn't. That's one thing. He wanted to give it a scientific mood. And the other scientific ground he wanted to give it was stolen from mathematics, because maths has this nice kind of inbuilt consistency and it all works. So it's a nice idea to think the economy is all inbuilt and all works, and this nice little formula it works too. And so he insisted on these two things, you might say, in order that economics would be taken seriously. But his other, as a science that is, but his other concern was that at least as I understand it, that the wealth of humanity should be equitably distributed. He was really concerned about the poor people. And so this was his, to solve that problem, he needed economics to become a science. And I think if you want to come to Steiner, you first have to know what Marshall was trying to do in the England of the late 19th, early 20th century. You have to know the huge power economics got when it separated itself from political economy. You have to know that was all embedded in the Victorian England, which had this huge power around the world. It's not no small thing what Marshall did. And you also have to know that Keynes was his direct disciple. And so everything in Keynes, who I will talk about quite a bit, who's the most important economist in the 20th century, everything in Keynes, he began with Marshall. And a lot of what Keynes had to do was overcoming Marshall, overcoming this notion of economics as scientific in the sense of physics and scientific in the sense of maths. Finding a ground for economics which is not stolen from mechanics and therefore not appropriate, and it's not living in the glory of mathematics, pretending it's like maths. It has to find its own equivalent glory, if you see what I'm trying to say. So unless one has a sense of this and takes it seriously, and many people who know Steiner's economics actually do not know about this, and they do not take it seriously, and they don't want to know anything about it. They want economics to be dragged back into political economy. They want to be dragged back into German economics. And those two things are ahistorical. You have to release it from political economy, release it from the German Central European economy, and get into this worldwide English economy, and then sort out the problems there. And this is what Marshall did in his, what I call his detachment. But his detachment was only going to run, I don't know, 80, 90 years. It would never be there forever. It just has this purpose of getting us to a place where you can see in 2008, where we see, the reliance of economics on maths and on physics has just run out of road. And you could see the huge wealth inequalities around the world. It also is not meeting Marshall's objective either. No way. But 2008 meant, I could put it on this drawing somewhere. When we get to that's a huge intervention in history. This is the point. Now we have a chance, and many people in economics say, okay, now we have to rethink economics completely. The Marshallian detachment has done its job. It's like in Barfield's world. So now we've detached ourselves from the great universe in which we originated. How are we going to get back in? And the image I often get is, because it shows my age, I grew up watching the Flintstones. The Flintstones in this awful American series of cartoons, but it always ended with Fred Flintstone putting the cat out. And he puts the cat, and something happens, and the cat runs in and shuts the door behind him. And Fred Flintstone's left banging on the door, asking Wilma to let him in. And it's just a stupid image, but it's a little bit like mankind now is so clever, right? We've dropped out of the gods, and now we think we're better, but we want to get back in. We want to head to this final participation, become gods with the gods or something like this, or at least partners with the gods. And I think that's a little bit our kind of story where we are. And the Marshallian detachment had the role in history to separate economics entirely from its political construct. It's a mirror of this nation-state world economy story until we get this clear, and then we will see the deficiencies that brings. But it's all latent in history. We've got to get to this point in order that we reconnect the economy in a way which doesn't take us back to times gone by. that sets us up for a future which will not look like the past, but it's equally valid to what we think was the good old days and so on. And so to come into Steiner's that very simple idea of describing a process, if you're Anglo-Saxon, you really need to have gone through the Marshallian detachment. Otherwise, you're not up to speed with history. You need to, as an economist, you need to know actually all this Marshallian stuff is okay, but it's not okay. On my terms, it's not okay. The economists have got to be the first ones to reinvent their science. They can't be told by people outside, you don't understand what's going on. They have to have this actual, as I would call actual soul experience, that actually we found limits to our knowledge and we recognize this. And now we're open to asking where things might go. But never will you tell me this. This I have to discover in my own experience. And everything I do in speaking, even speaking at length, I'm always have this in mind. When am I going to get my audience or my listener to say, okay, I get that. You're not bossing me about. You're not trying to regulate me. You're leading me to a point where I can see, yes, the reductionism served a purpose. But in my own experience, I get that point. It's very delicate. You're going to move from Kantian limits to knowledge to Aristotelian, there are no limits to knowledge. This is a fundamental challenge anyone in economics is going to have to face. And with that, if you have that idea, then you can read Steiner with some, you lighten the load considerably when you get into what he then says.
Like if you treat it as a machine, it's as if you know everything, but you need to acknowledge that you don't know anything. It's a living process.
It doesn't admit to Kantian analysis. That's the problem. So if you have a Kantian analysis, if you think this is Hayek's main problem, Friedrich von Hayek, he believed in limits of knowledge or limits to knowledge. And so if you accept that, you will say things like ceteris paribus. You need to kind of create a box around what you're looking at in order for your thinking to function. It's very subtle. And in this book I wrote called Finance at the Threshold, it has a chapter. It's the epistemology stupid, which is a kind of riff off Bill Clinton's speechwriter back in 1993, I think. It's the economy stupid. Well, it's never that. It's the epistemology stupid. You really have to understand that if you want to put things in a box, that's okay, but you are self-limiting yourself by your own admission. And so until people see, when they say that thinking outside the box, I always say, what's the box? You've got a box on it. What are you talking about? You must be talking about the brain, because I can give you a whole chapter about how the brain came about and how the brain might evolve. But the moment when people say they're thinking outside the box, they mean they're thinking with thought beyond their senses, outside the brain. So if they would just say, I'm thinking outside the brain, they would get the problem they have. And until they experience this in some way, how they word it is up to them. But until they experience that when we get to this point here, it just happens to be, we become super self-aware when we become so boxed into our thinking that we can't get out of it. And so everyone says, let's have some blue sky thinking. Let's think outside the box. They have no idea what they're talking about, their soul experience. But if they would just say, oh, the box, that's the brain, then they would be able to sort the problems out themselves. But it's anything you do with economics, you have to know this is going on in the background. And I can say it like I've said it now because there's a bit of a context for saying it. But normally I wouldn't say that until I felt my listeners were experiencing a problem. What is this box? And it's just simple little stupid bit of English. Why call it a box? Or if you're so rational, you economists, if you're so rational, name this box. And then in English, we easily say, he's a brain box. So we obviously mean, when we talk about the box, we actually mean the brain. We don't dare say why we call it a box. Because if we explored that, we would never get, look at the brain. It's as unbox-like as you could possibly imagine. So why people call it a box? They should maybe just draw a brain and then draw a box. That would be fun to do. And I said, why do you think this is that? So it's kind of no way. If I'm in a central bank or something like that, where we're not having this kind of discussion, someone would just say in passing, oh, we got to think outside the box. if I put my hand up and say, "Excuse me, what's the box?" I will never do that, right? Because that would be kind of not very fruitful. But I might say in a coffee break, "Excuse me, what did you think what's the box you were referring to?" Because you just have to say, "Draw a brain, draw a box," and why do you think that is this? And if you're bothered, but a lot of people are not bothered. If you're bothered, you would sort that out in your own mind. And when you see the brain is this, you will stop saying that is a mechanism.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to force you to, I can't force you to this soul experience. You're going to have to find it and own it. And then we'll tease our way out of the problem we've all got, right? And I think the problem is absolutely existential. It doesn't need, again, I would always say you can solve it on the ground of accounting. This will always give you a ground. But at first instance, when you first come across this in a meeting or in whatever it might be, in a paper or something, this is so existential. You can't simply say the brain is not a box, mate. You have to lead someone to understand this situation. Otherwise, epistemologically, they're not apt for the world they're going to talk about. And this is what Steiner says about Adam Smith. It's great, his idea about supply and demand and so on. It's just not apt to the subject matter. You don't say that in a hurry in the Adam Smith Institute. I can tell you that from experience.
Yeah.
You know, but it's the 10th lecture Steiner gives, and he just shows how he's not opposed to Adam Smith. He just says Adam Smith takes a very simple example, and you can look at that from 3 different points of view, and he's right, but he hasn't thought enough. So and economics, because it depends on multiple independent variables, you can't leave it down to give me 2, and the third one arises out of these 2. That's the whole epistemological construct of modern economics.
Yeah.
Give me 2 independent variables, I will have the third one. And Steiner says, no, you have multiple independent variables. So if you can think like this, you are in this space. I'm not my reductionist self any longer. I find myself by discovering everything else, which is not me. That's how I find myself, really. And so it's a strange thing to be talking about, but unless that's understood or somehow managed, nothing's going to happen. You know, even the ideas I'm having here will get no traction, except in people who've been able to solve this problem. And so whether it's me talking to you or whether it's me talking to a central banker or an expert in finance, is always the same story. But I always accompany it with the history of accounting, because that gives absolute solid ground. It's the most ephemeral thing you can imagine. You know, what is it? Double entry bookkeeping, but it's so solid in this realm. Right? And once you get that, then people can actually make this shift without feeling they're being attacked or without going to some sort of psychological drama or whatever they have to go through. So absolutely, I think this is to understand Steiner's economics, whatever part of it you look at, you need to have gone through this process. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense what he's saying.